Good morning. I'm just going to run and grab my glasses really quickly. I'll be right back. Alrighty, there we go. I just didn't want to scare you with my lazy eye. So, I'm going to sort of half wait for others to arrive and half start my topic. Because this is being recorded, so anyone who wants to catch up after the fact can do it. So this week is about the question of what is qi. Like that is a dead horse. It's already been, looked over many times. I think we know most of the positions about what qi is, but it's still worth talking about. And I would say that the question of what qi is something that has to be grappled with. It's not like a super easy to deal with question. It's actually a fairly nuanced question. It needs a lot of finesse to deal with, because if we try to make qi into a single category thing, it empirically we can't find any basis to support it at all. And there's been plenty of research done on it, both mostly unsuccessful, and then some research which, of course, doesn't quite jive with the standards of the science of our day. So, but even though as a single function entity we can't prove that qi exists, the important thing to remember is that that's never been how qi has been defined. So qi, I think one of the things that we seriously get wrong in the qigong community is that qi is not a singular item. It's not like you could, do a test, figure out exactly what it is, and say, aha, I've got it, that's qi. That's what qi is. And it's just electromagnetic field or something like that. We can't say that, because that's never been how any of the disciplines that deal with qi have actually understood it. So I think we need to go in a bunch of different directions in this talk, and it's really difficult in a certain sense, because there's at least 5 or 6 independent directions that we have to go in. However, coming from a background in history, I always like to look at things from the genealogical perspective first, because understanding genealogies of things helps us to understand how they have ended up being understood the way that they are. So the first thing about the genealogy of the term qi is where it comes from as a Chinese character and concept. So before we get into the sort of precise history of the exact origin of the character qi, we have to look a little bit at some of the context in which it's used. I would say that sort of the key context in which qi is used in a modern sense is referring to air, basically. Like the air outside is called kongqi, right? The weather is called tianqi, right? Kongqi means empty qi or empty air. Tianqi means air in the sky, right? So, relative to that, they're talking about either the quality of the air or the weather. So, when you have, for instance, polluted air, right? 空气污染 would be polluted air. You wouldn't say 天气污染, right? You wouldn't say you might, I don't know. But you don't usually say the weather has pollution. You would say that the air itself has pollution. So we have this sort of modern use of the term qi that is really, really, really highly defined as something relative to the sky and relative to weather. Now, getting to the genealogical part, we go back to the sort of original first iterations of the character qi. And you know what? Maybe I will try to use my drawing tool. Let me see if I can do that. No, that's not what I want. Okay, guys, I might not be smart enough to use the drawing tool here. No, okay, forget it. Sorry, I'll try to figure out how that works in a future live stream, and we can do that. But anyway, the original character for qi, it means clouds, basically. And it was made up of 3 squiggly lines, indicating cloud, basically. So that original character for qi probably goes back to the oracle bone carvings, so the earliest Chinese script from the Shang dynasty. One of the nifty things about the oracle bone carvings is that a lot of the stuff that emanated from that, a lot of the characters that emanated from that, were based actually on creating maps for understanding battlefields and you know, geopolitics and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting that all of these things, like, you know, the way that we understand the way that you know, medieval Chinese people, and then by proxy us in the Qigong and Taoism and Chinese medicine community, understand things like the directions, understand things like the movement of the sun and moon and stuff like that, and clouds and so on and so forth, right? A lot of this stuff actually comes from military strategy, which is neat. But another thing that presents to us is it, you know, presents Chinese topography, because one of the things about, you know, the Chinese belief system is that it's not universal, in the sense that the entire belief system is predicated on the actual physical realities inside of China proper. You know, the way that their directions work, the way that weather happens to manifest in different directions, the way that you know, all of that different stuff is predicated on, you know, systems of rivers, mountains, valleys, and stuff that's, you know, very particular sort of topographical landform stuff, actually basically in the middle of China, going in any direction, you know, and that belief system is you know, very, very specific, because topography doesn't work in the same way in every part of the world. But getting away from that brief diversion, so qi in ancient times, like very, very ancient times, referred to cloud cover, basically. Now the idea gets elaborated on. So one of the things that I think is a kind of neat problem is that we have there is a debate that goes on surrounding Chinese characters about you know, which characters are the most legitimate. And you have a lot of people in places like Hong Kong or Taiwan, you know, and even some people in Japan who make these arguments that the Ming Dynasty style characters, or like late Qing Dynasty style characters that they use are somehow more traditional and more legitimate than the simplified modern characters. But one of the things I think is really neat is that a lot of the simplified modern characters are actually representative of really old characters. So the current iteration of the character for qi that we see is actually much more similar to the oracle carving iteration of qi, which was from, you know, the very earliest sort of origin of the Chinese written language. So that's the PRC simplified version. Another you know, really important character is wu, which means nothing, or emptiness, for lack of a better word. And that one that is used in Taiwan and other places, it did exist during ancient Chinese history, but there was another character from the state of Chu, which is basically a different version of the word tian, which means sky, and that character has the same meaning as wu, and that's the one that's used in simplified Chinese. So when the next time you have a conversation with somebody and they try to make this whole language thing into a black and white, sort of easily defined along political lines kind of thing. Just remember that they have their own goals, and as Terence McKenna said, a man must have a plan, and a man without a plan will become part of somebody else's plan. So don't let that happen to you, folks. Anyway, so going on from there, you have this character Qi, and it develops over time. But it's always been associated with the sky. It stopped eventually being associated with clouds. Different words came in to replace Qi, like yun, for instance, to talk about clouds, and other words, a different version of the sound wu to talk about fog, and all kinds of stuff like that. So then what Qi eventually came to be associated basically is air. Now, how did this make it into Qigong? Right? So number one, I am going to forward an argument here, which I think you've probably never heard before, but I think it's true, which is that Qigong is older than meditation in China. Qigong existed hundreds, if not more than 1,000 years before, really well-developed seated meditation systems in China. Not under the name Qigong, right? It was under a number of different names, like Daoyan or, Cunse, Cunxiang, Tuna, and so on. But Qigong in China has existed for longer than really, like, well-organized seated meditation. You could argue that there is meditation in the Zhuangzi. There's one chapter that mentions seated meditation there. But really, the majority of the practice for most of the early history of, Taoism especially, was more oriented toward things that we would broadly incorporate into the family of Qigong in modern times. So, this is a kind of interesting thing that these people at that time, they understood moving air inside of the body, right? So this is really one of the first major important definitions of the word Qi. But I want to do something today that isn't this argument that I've made in the past. I want to build on this argument a little bit in a different direction. I still need to reiterate it so that I can jump to the next step of the argument. Basically, this view of Qi is that the Qing Qi, or the clear Qi, comes in from the sky when we breathe in. It goes into the lungs, it gets passed through the pulmonary system, and it travels around the body, and it nourishes all the tissues. So that's one vision of the word Qi. That Qi is carried in the blood. So it's the function of the blood in Qi, right? This is a major theory of Chinese medicine. It's a major theory of parts of Taoism. It's a major theory, obviously, of Qigong in every generation of Qigong. But it's definitely not the whole story. But it's a very, very, very important part of the story. So that gives us one theory of Qi. And it's a theory of Qi that is actually pretty empirically viable. I mean, we know that oxygen and other components of air come into the body via respiration, and not just respiration of the nose, right? We also have skin respiration. Apparently, animals can, do respiration through their butts in some cases if they have to. I just read an article about that the other day. I don't know, haven't looked into it too much, but I'm certainly not there yet. It makes me wonder about embryonic breathing, though. So, we have all of these different types of respiration in which gases are essentially exchanged. And then, of course, the other half of that theory is that when the body's done with all the Qing Qi, then it carries back Zhuo Qi, or it carries back turbid Qi, through the veins, essentially, and puts it back out into the environment. So we have that exchange of gases, which is one vision of Qi. So that's the easiest one to get definitive proof for. That's the easiest one to build a theory for. That's why I've always followed it, right? I always think that, like, one of our big jobs is going to be to validate that these things have a basis in something that's actually tangible. So let's do the tangible stuff first, and then we'll move on to the intangible stuff later. I'm starting to get ready to talk about things that are another order outside of that are moving toward a more intangible part. But let's still build the map of this Qi stuff first. So Taoism and Chinese medicine take two different directions. And of course, Qigong is just straddled straight down the middle of those two things. Because it's neither Taoist or is it Chinese medicine. It borrows from both. So Taoism, if essentially, views qi as partly this, air and blood function, but more importantly, qi is the generating and motivating force which causes birth. And that's the birth of anything. That's the birth of the universe. That's the birth of, zygote, generation of a zygote, right? That's the generation of, a bug or, a plant in a seed and so on and so forth, right? So we have qi as a generative function. Qi as a generative function, Taoism looks at it as a universally consistent event. So every time things get generated, it comes from, something coming together and causing basically a burst of, motivation. In the case of humans, it's like, sperm and egg, or in the case of, animals like birds, for instance, right? It's this whole thing where they, rub their cloacas together or something like that, right? And so on and so forth, right? And you end up with this thing that essentially develops out of a, state where there's a dormant factor, which is the yin factor. So the egg, the encasement of the embryo or the womb, right? There's always a big yin factor that warms yang, and then yang is this developing life. And so then when it's mature, it's able to break out of the shell, so to speak. So the shell of humans is the womb. The shell of animals that come from eggs is the egg, obviously. The shell of the universe is original chaos, right? Hundun. So this is something, it looks like this is one of the ones where it looks like it ought to be true. Right, so we can't get as good of a definitive take. We can't say, we have a perfect correlated thing in modern science that allows us to validate this. That's not absolutely, perfect, but it's still a pretty good working theory. It's not that far out on a limb, right? All things get created and they go through a development stage. It's not like things develop backwards, right? Things develop from this initial creation that seems to come out of nowhere, but really comes out of different factors coming together. And then they develop within that creation and they mature. And then once they grow up and mature, then they start to decline. And pretty much every living thing at least follows that quality. And, arguably a lot of actual material structures in the world also follow similar qualities, right? So we have, it's a relatively pretty dang good theory. It's not, I don't think it's a hypothesis. I think it's actually a theory. It's, on a philosophical level. But the thing is that Chinese philosophy doesn't just do philosophy for the fun of it. It's not just like, well, let's think about how things work. It's but not do anything about it. Actually, it's really, really applied. It's always applied. So in Taoism, the application of that is then figuring out how to reproduce that in your own body, right? You take advantage of it. You have this available capital that you know about, and you can learn to take advantage of it. And that's what, effectively what Neidan is, or that's effectively what, to some extent what Zuowang is. Zuowang doesn't quite do as good of a job of it as Neidan, but it still, gets half the job done. So, again, another very good, working theory of qi that has a real application. Okay, so, but that is again not where it stops. We have another working theory of qi, which is the Chinese medicine working theory of qi. And the Chinese medicine working theory of qi is way more complex because it is about lots of different physiological factors coming together in different geographical areas of the body. You have the independent functions of the organs, you have the interrelationships of the organs, and so on and so forth. In my opinion, this is the one that is by far the most difficult to accurately prove. So, in my opinion, the basic philosophical premises of Taoism, the basic concept of qi as air, the basic concept of qi as something that comes into the body via respiration, and even the concept, like the TCM or the Chinese medicine concept of qi coming from food, right, energy moving in the blood from food, all are very, very, very good theories. Actually, I just want to touch on that one too, right? Because you have shui gu zhi qi, right? You have the qi of water and grains, which just means the energy that you get from food that again circulates inside of the blood and nourishes the body. All of these things are, and of course the correlate of zhuo qi there, which is once it's turned into urine and defecation, would be the correlate there with turbid qi. But so once you get past that, though, then you get to like the qi of certain organs, the interrelationship of qi, let's say between the heart and the kidneys, or the kidneys and the liver, and then you have jing and qi and stuff like that. I'm not saying that it can't be proven. What I'm saying is it's more difficult to prove because I'm gonna tell you about one of my own sort of philosophical observations, and people have said this before. I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but the more complex an idea gets, the more elaborate an idea gets, the harder it is to verify it, and the more likely it is to have at least parts of it falsified. So what I mean by that is, well, I mean, there's plenty of native English speakers in this audience. You guys all know what going out on a limb means, right? So going out on a limb, for those who might not know the term, if you are on a tree, if you're climbing a tree, the best place to stay is pretty close to the center of the tree, because the center of the tree is a lot more stable than the branches, which are called limbs. If you go out on a limb, what it means is you're going out on the branch of the tree, and it's a lot less stable. You're a lot more likely actually to break the branch and fall out. So that, again, is the same way that speculative science and speculative philosophy work, right? If you speculate about something and you take it from a base assumption, which is pretty easy to verify, where your core axioms are, and maybe where you have some paradigms, but then you extend it out into extrapolations, the farther out you go on the limb, the harder it is to verify. So one of the problems with the organ system as we know it in Chinese medicine, and then the qi related to that, is that it's very, there are many parts of it which are difficult to verify. Because people haven't, in doing research, people haven't found these legitimate relationships. Now, this is where I think it's important to talk about the structure of the meridians. I think one of the things that everybody who's done Qigong for enough time with good instruction knows is that the meridians are real. And people who've been doing Qigong a bit longer know that acupoints are real. These are, legit. Like, there's no question about it from a feeling perspective. However, the problem is, what are you feeling when you open a meridian? What are you feeling when you get in touch with an acupoint? Right? That feeling is qi, which is a descriptor, right? It's a very practical descriptor. But the problem is, what's the actual sensation? So I think this is going to be a major issue we have to deal with. Chinese medicine has been thinking about it scientifically since at least, maybe 200 years, right? Because they already at the start of the Qing dynasty, they had books like Yilin Gaicuo, right, correcting the mistakes of the medical classics, and talking about how functions of perception were located in the brain rather than in the heart, for instance, right? So people have been thinking about these problems. It's like, where does feeling come from? Now, one of the things I'll say is that ancient Chinese medicine from the Yellow Emperor's internal classic actually have these ideas latently contained in them. And so the argument in Yilin Gaicuo was that that Confucian Chinese medicine practitioners hijacked the idea of consciousness and aligned it with Confucian ideas about the heart. And that is also in Suwen, the simple questions chapters of the internal classic. But in Lingshu, the spiritual pivot of the internal classic, they talk about the consciousness coming from the brain marrow, right? Brain marrow is another word for, brain and then nervous system, right? Because they knew about that stuff. They were doing dissection. It was within their purview to know about that stuff and understand the functions of those places. So you have these two different views in the internal classic. One is in the simple questions, and the other is in the spiritual pivot about how consciousness works. And in the simple questions, this actually aligns really well with our idea about qi and respiration and blood. So the spirit is carried around the body because of the movement of the blood. Okay, so, but then how does that work in relation to this idea of the brain marrow, or, to say it in a modern way, the nervous system? Well, the way that it works is that you can have consciousness emanating from the nervous system because the nerves go everywhere in the body. If qi is being carried around in the blood, and it's what allows the nerves to function so that we feel things and we're aware of our bodies, then there is interplay between blood and qi and so-called spirit or perception related to the brain marrow or related to the nerves, right? So we actually have a system where if you put the two blocks together, you get a really comprehensive little package there. The issue is that throughout much of Chinese medicine history, there was not a very good putting together of those ideas. People picked up the idea of the heart as the leader of perception, which is a Confucian idea and a Taoist idea. And they really ran with that. And it wasn't until the late Ming and early Qing dynasty that you see the Chinese medicine people and the Taoists coming out and saying, you know what, actually, perception is pretty obviously emanating from the brain, right? This is pretty clear. There's some question about whether or not this was like a protected secret in Taoism, or whatever. But really, the late Qing dynasty is where they really start to ramp up the discussion about that. So we can see that part of the problem with qi in Chinese medicine is that the original classics, the original documents, like the internal classic, they have all these different ideas. And the different ideas are disparate ideas that likely came together as a result of taking a comprehensive view of all of the Chinese medicine traditions at that time in history and putting them together in one place and then making them function together, right? So and that's probably also how the Tao Te Ching was written. So a lot of ideas in the Chinese world, they get sewn together as a tapestry of many, many different ideas over hundreds of years. And so what it means is that sometimes finding the harmony there is actually, it's not always that clear, although there usually is some harmony there. And so that means that it's easy to take a chunk of it, the chunk that you like, obviously, or the chunk that's popular, more likely the chunk that's popular, actually. And you take a chunk of it and you run with it and you say, okay, that's what it means. The problem is that that doesn't stand up robustly enough as a theory. So you've got to look at it comprehensively again and find out what's the big picture. Because inside of the little picture, it's like, the idea that the consciousness is located in the heart is laughable by modern scientific standards. But the idea that consciousness is located in the brain and it requires the function of circulation to be able to have it in every part of the body, and especially in the brain, is not laughable at all. I mean, that's just like, it's empirically true, right? So in order to understand these ideas, you have to really look at the thing from the big picture view, and that can be difficult because a lot of the time the ideas have been sort of encased inside of acceptable narrative structures. And the reason for that is bureaucracy, right? So we need bureaucracies. We can't live without bureaucracies in a highly developed society, but bureaucracy often defines what we're allowed to talk about and what we're not allowed to talk about. And so if the view of a certain idea becomes canonical, then it's very hard to break free from that structure. And certainly, anybody in power who has something to lose by not letting you talk about by letting you talk about something, they're not going to let you talk about it. So we can see a lot of these ideas that are canonical, like the idea of the heart being the residence of the spirit, probably were kept in place by bureaucratic functions more than anything. And certainly there were plenty of bureaucratic machinations during, the medieval Chinese empires that would have contributed to this, right? I mean, even for certain periods of time, things like massage were illegal in Chinese medicine. So very important things to know about, right? Anyway, so, but moving along, we can say that this view of qi, right, there's these sort of three major dominant views that live together. And so just to sum those up, you have the idea of air coming into the body and circulating in the blood. you have the idea of these complex interrelations of qi that are in the organs and are related to the meridians and stuff like that. And then you have the view of qi that it's this creative force that makes things, and that it can be harnessed. So those are sort of three really dominant narrative structures of qi. So now jumping to the 20th century and the 21st century, we have this serious problem, which is that those ideas are holistic ideas. They explain something that is tangible on the feeling level, and it can be expressed between two people. But it doesn't actually suggest, none of those theories except for the one about respiration actually suggest anything that we could run effective tests on. Like, can you run an effective test on the first glimmer of a new being and understand what the motivating creative force of that is? I don't think anybody's comprehensively talked about that. It's not even on the radar of most modern science, because they think of that as being like a religious idea almost. It's not a religious idea. Obviously, that first glimmer of life energy has to come from somewhere. It's not like it's not like dead matter is always created everywhere. There's always something that animates the matter, but modern science doesn't even want to deal with that, as far as I can tell. I mean, maybe you have some of the more sort of far reaches of physics looking at that, but for the most part, that's not a thing. So we're not going to get a really good discussion of qi surrounding that, right? They're going to say, well, that one's a religious idea. We're not going to touch it on a good day, and on a bad day we'll criticize it. In terms of the relationship of like the channels and stuff like that, there's lots of ways to verify that the channels exist just by looking at the structure of the body, right? The channels just describe the shape of the body, basically, and the way that all of the muscles, sinews, bones, and all this stuff travel together, and then where they have depressions, and where the inside and outside are more closely or more distally attached to each other, and so on and so forth. Pretty easy to verify just by actually looking at the body and thinking of the body as being this fractal structure, right, that builds from inside out and outside in. But the thing is, if you want to think about it as something that has this real material called qi, which is moving and should be able to be observed, well, I think that has more or less been trashed as a theory. However, from the perspective of people who do qigong, or from the perspective of people who do neidan, it's real because we can feel it objectively. But the problem is there's no good way to study it. So this has led to interesting research in the 20th century in China, in the qigong field and the Chinese medicine field. The problem with the research is that the early research was very much predicated on using traditional ideas as the axiomatic base, and then basically running tests on it where generalized reporting of feeling coming from test subjects was used as a way to verify that the sensation was qi and that it was moving in the meridians. So what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that what you're doing is you're getting a subjective report from a number of clients or a number of test subjects. And so even if all of your test subjects subjectively feel the basic path of the large intestine channel when you put an acupuncture needle into one of the points of the channel, the problem is that reporting is subjective if you don't have any tools to actually measure what the phenomenon might be. I have lots of ideas for what the phenomenon might be. It could be a nervous system phenomenon, it could be hormonally related, it could be a number of things like that. But the main point is, even if you get consistent, and there's never been consistent 100% replicated actions on any channel in any major test, as far as I know. But even if you got these consistent results, the problem is that those results would end up being the subjective reports of your test subjects, which are very, very easily explained by, their own desire to create a result, or wishful thinking, or, having an idea placed into them by the researcher, and so on and so forth, right? No way you're going to verify those studies. It's impossible. So those studies, although they're very interesting, unfortunately, they don't manage to do the thing. The next major problem is that the way that qi has been explained has always been explained through the perspective of whatever the latest technology or whatever the latest scientific findings are. So, in the 19th century, qi was explained as this thing that was like a steam engine. In the 20th century, qi was explained as this thing that was like wave vibrations. Now, well, you know what, actually, I don't think we've got a correlate now, because that area of study has more or less been shut down. So the wishful thinking, we're going to make sure everything lines up with tradition while we use scientific jargon area of studying qi, I think has been pretty much discredited. I don't think we're going to have to worry about it coming back, because it's something that obviously they're going out on a limb with, right? So I think that's good. If that one goes to the trash bin, that's good. But what that means is that any new studies that come out, or any new ways that we think about this, should probably be seen through the lens of systems theory. So what do I mean? What I mean is, when you look at qi as a phenomenon, let's say from a qigong perspective, because that's what we really care about here, right? We care about qigong and we care about neidan, as far as I know. So from that perspective, then how do we explain these phenomenon? Because they're different, right? Very, very strong qi moving up the du meridian to the head is totally different than having a buzzing feeling in your hands. And it's also very different from having a warm feeling in your lower dantian. These are obviously not the same thing that's happening in each individual case. That's one of the reasons why Taoism talks about alchemical stuff, because alchemy is transformation of new materials by mixing different materials. So what I would argue is that in order to understand the functions of qi in the body from any perspective, we have to be looking at it from the perspective of systems. So, what are the requirements of, complex relationships in the body that are needed to produce the sensation of qi, or to produce the results of qi as described, for instance, in Chinese medicine, and then how do they work as systems together in order to create different qi situations. And so, a good question would be, why is it that placing the attention on the lower abdomen and breathing in a certain way for a certain period of time while making the mind quiet is enough to make qi move in the channels, right? That would be something that we could observe from many different perspectives. We could look at it from the hormonal perspective, right, which of course exists in Taoism and Chinese medicine, right? What is tiangui, heavenly water, right? Reproductive fluid in one sense, but in another sense, it kind of means something that's similar to hormones. And so we can look at it from those perspectives. We could look at it from a nervous system perspective, right? Why is it the spine lights up when the du meridian opens? The spine is like the place that carries nerves from the brain to the rest of the body. And it's also the place that, allows messages to come in from the rest of the body to the brain, right? So then those things could be looked at from those two perspectives. Those things are relatively possible to monitor, right? You can monitor neurological activity, you can monitor hormonal activity, and you might be able to get closer to an answer about what the physiological sensation of qi is. But that doesn't answer the deeper question, which is, why does this have a rehabilitative effect on the body? This is the more important question. This is the deeper question. Right? Why is it that having the sensation of qi moving freely in our bodies and developing more strongly in our bodies allows us to recover from illness, or allows us to recover from injury, or allows us to recover from bad posture or mental problems, right? That's the question that is looking past the sail, right? Because the sail is qi. You can build your qi, but what good is building the qi if you're still in pain and you still feel upset. But the thing is that that's what the qi does. It cleans it all up. And it fixes a lot of the problems, or it helps you to gradually fix the problems, which then later, of course, you figure out that the problems are actually based on your own behavior, and then that's also looking past the sale. But the point is, the rehabilitative function is actually the deeper question. And so understanding, okay, what is this sensation of qi, is a very, very, good question to ask. We need to ask it, but we need to be looking at it in ways that could actually provide us with some meaningful results. So how would a study about that conceivably look? How would we set that up? Well, honestly, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I just talk on the internet. But I could see, something where you could, I know that there are studies that have looked at relative levels of dopamine, for instance, or relative level of endorphin, right? B-endorphin. There's a couple of very popular studies that look at beta endorphin levels in the blood after a result of mindfulness meditation. And basically people have said that meditators experience something very similar to the runner's high. So I suspect that's probably not going on I don't think that's the main thing that happens when the dew meridian opens, but I bet you that when the qi breaks into the brain and there's a big flow of comfort and all the muscles relax, I bet you that might have something to do with that, right? So again, we can look at it hormonally, or we can look at it from the perspective of the parasympathetic nervous system, right? The rest and recovery nervous system, right? When we meditate, we go into this state of rest and recovery that's similar to deep sleep. So again, taking those tacks and for a moment, leaving behind ideas like the ones posited in the mid-20th century of, bioelectric currents and energy fields and so on and so forth, and leaving behind the 19th century ideas of steam pumps, maybe we can look at things in an entirely different direction. And instead of trying to verify that qi exists as an independent entity, this is where I'm going with this, by the way, guys. Instead of verifying that qi exists as an independent entity, looking at it as something that's related to sensation, that's created in the body, that is created through complex phenomena like the interplay of the CNS and parasympathetic nervous system and hormones, right? Because if we understand that qi on the level of sensation is a feeling, it's not necessarily completely correlated with the concept of, let's say, nutrition or the concept of oxygenation, right? These, again, are factors that exist within the ecosystem of qi, right? So oxygen moving in the blood. Obviously, if your hand is not receiving enough oxygen, your hand is going to become numb because you're not getting enough blood, you're not getting enough oxygen. You get enough oxygen, you get enough blood, and feeling returns. If you have an injury, what happens when you have an injury? The blood cells coagulate and they collect, and basically they start to heal up the injury. So what's that? That creates a blockage, right? That's either a qi blockage or blood stagnation in Chinese medicine, right? So we need to get the blood flow to move smoothly through those regions again. And so that, again, is one of these functions of being able to, get the oxygen in the blood to go there and also get feeling to go there, right? Again, we're looking at a complex system. We're not looking at independent, small variables. It's many variables within a system. And I think that would be that's the future of, if anybody wants to research qi, if they're not already sick of it. Do I see it going there? Maybe in the USA, but I kind of doubt it. I don't think that the Americans are going to want to pick it up because it's not important. It's not important from the perspective of moving forward the current agenda. In China, I kind of doubt it. I think, maybe it's been done a bit, but I think it's also really not on the agenda. I think that, the part of Chinese culture that cares the most about qi is Chinese medicine. And I think that they are going to continue to develop in a direction that's deeply influenced by modern science. I think that the writing is on the wall there. Would it be good if they researched, systems and qi and that kind of stuff more? For sure. Will they do it? Probably to some extent, but I don't think it's going to be number one on the agenda by any means. So I think we're going to continue to see qi as being this tremendous mystery. But the reason why I like to talk about these things once in a while is because they're worth thinking about if you do qigong meditation or Chinese medicine, because you're dealing with these things on a daily basis. But, again, you need to always think past the sale, right? In Gailin Cuo Gai Cuo Yilin Gai Cuo, sorry, my brain needs more qi. In Yilin Gai Cuo, the correcting mistakes of the medical manuscripts, one of the things that it says is, in the past, they put forward a theory of treatment that worked, but it was based on a flawed concept. So people knew this even before modern science and modern medicine started, invading in Chinese medicine. They understood that the basic concepts at the origins of Chinese medicine were, are you allowed to use, I don't think I'm allowed to use that word, so I'm going to use another word. They were original, and the problem with original concepts is that they haven't been fully developed. Arguably, at least according to my perspective on this, I don't necessarily expect you to agree, but according to my perspective on this, I think the thing that stopped them from developing scientifically was basically the fact that the Confucians ran a big enough part of the government that they could shut down discussion about things, and so science and philosophy basically got halted during the Han Dynasty, arguably during the Qin, really, which predated the Han, and that it never recovered. So, the flourishing of the 100 schools of Chinese philosophy stopped, cold stop, and all the Confucians were buried alive. But when they came back, they appropriated the totalitarian social methods of Qin Shi Huangdi, and they shut down the discussion. I think that's what happened. And so Chinese sciences have always done really well because they're, the Chinese world is a brilliant place, and on top of that, they had all of these geopolitical issues that required them to make really fast changes to their society, which of course is still true today. So, but what that means is that, let's say, like in the Ming Dynasty, where you had these early iterations of automatic weapons, right? They were not things that ended up being supported by a really robust theory of chemistry, which could explain, why gunpowder worked, or so on and so forth, right? And so they weren't able to mature fast enough and robustly enough that it made a big difference to Chinese society. On the other hand, Europe, which was in the middle of its scientific revolution at that point, picked those things up and absolutely went buck wild with them because they picked them apart and figured out how they worked. So, I think that those days are over. You know what I mean? Like I think that our scientific revolution has slowed down to a snail's pace now. And even though you hear about new tech and stuff coming out all the time, I think actually the development speed of science has slowed down a lot. But, nonetheless, right, it's always ideas get shut down by bureaucracies which don't want freedom of intellectual movement. And they don't want freedom of intellectual movement for all kinds of reasons, but at the end of the day, it's self-serving, right? It's the thing that they believe creates stability in society, and stability in society always, of course, comes at the price of the elites getting what they want, and new social inspiration not necessarily being able to bubble to the surface. So I suspect one of the reasons why we've never seen a really robust, theory of qi which can be verified, is largely related to that, because there's way of thinking that are deemed okay, and there's ways of thinking that are deemed dangerous. If you look at our own societies, of course, we also suffer from that, so we can't be pointing fingers in that regard, but I really do feel like that's probably what happened. And it's always speculatively interesting to think what would have happened to the Chinese philosophy world and to Chinese science if it hadn't all been shut down in the Qin dynasty by Qin Shi Huangdi. I bet it would have been absolutely stunning what they would have come up with. But in any event, the stuff that they came up with is already pretty stunning. So and we're all enjoying the fruits of that 2,000 years later. So it ain't bad. But anyway, yeah, that's my rant about what she is this morning. I know I've given this talk probably 5 times, and the reason why I keep giving this talk is because every time it changes a little bit. I started out this journey just thinking that qi was, energy that moves in the channels. And then I read Jiang Weiqiao's books. And he talks about qi as being related to circulation and oxygen in blood. And then I started reading Neidan more. And Neidan, of course, has this pre-celestial qi thing. So each generation of when I would give this talk would change, right? And that, I think, my goal here is that I would like to present the idea that knowledge and learning about these subjects, even though they're relatively narrow subjects, it doesn't stop. You can get more sophisticated and you can keep going with it. And this is kind of where I hope that we'll go as a community. Because when I look at, our community of online Taoism, online Qigong, online Chinese medicine, the thing I mainly see is infighting. It's basically like, because of economic interests, we have, large groups of people who want to, hurl projectiles at each other and hopefully run away with all the money. And that doesn't help anybody except the individual people who profit from that. So what I'm hoping in the future is that our community will have an intellectual renaissance, and that we'll be able to have a whole retinue of people who are researching in many different directions and coming up with realistic and very robust possibilities to explain these things. I don't see it there right now, but there's a few people doing this stuff, and we're trying hard to band together in whatever ways we can. So it'll be interesting. But here's hoping to our continued and wonderful cooperation. Cheers. So I'm gonna get out of here, and we've got people coming to fix the electrical stuff in our house tomorrow. So I gotta do a big cleanup, and then I'm gonna go walk in the park. So I hope you all have a wonderful day or night wherever you are. Again, it's always a pleasure. And yeah, that's that. Toodles.